Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to our panel, Bias in AI, the Unseen Customer. I am joined today by Larry Adams of xStereotype and Camilla Cruz of Sparks and Honey. So I'll let you, before we kick it off, just give your 30-second spiel background.
Thanks for the time limit. Shaquana Group Black, thank you so much for having me here. My name is Larry Adams. I'm the co-founder, CEO of xStereotype. xStereotype is a data platform that evaluates bias, inclusion, authenticity, belonging, and associates that with purchase intent and likability of content. So we help brands connect insights into how to drive more authentic connections and drive business. And we have done that over the last 36 months. Sorry. Okay, I'm not going to move. Our platform is a data platform, so it plugs into different systems and helps look at scripts, briefs, social media posts, influencer content, and gives 39 different metrics, but also suggestions on how to be more inclusive that drives engagement.
I'm Camilla Cruz. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Sparks and Honey. Our company was founded in 2012 with a simple idea. We want to help organizations and brands understand how culture is changing. So to do that, we build a consulting practice on top of a cultural intelligence platform that we call Q. What Q does best is read a full spectrum of data coming from fast to slow culture in 140 countries, 16 languages. It categorizes cultural signals against a taxonomy of trends that we call the elements of culture. This is a taxonomy of 120 strong trends, which we refresh frequently. And what it allows us to do is to really understand how is cultural change impacting a specific category or consumer group, brand, and then so we can see that change happening in ways that allows us to identify threats and opportunities for brand. And this matters because in change we find a lot of opportunity, and things are changing really, really fast. So over the last 12 years, we've got the opportunity to work with 1 in 5 Fortune 100 companies, and our work typically informs anything from positioning, new brand ideas, product development, and innovation.
Great. So both of you are in the nitty-gritty, but also on the edge of this transition that we're moving into. Larry, can you talk about the work that xStereotype is doing to ensure that content is culturally relevant and unbiased?
Sure. One of the things the reason I started this company was, and I tell this story a lot. I was the Black person that got asked, "What do you think of this ad?" Or "What do you think of this content?" And it felt like, oh my gosh, there has to be a better way. And in my experience, in my world, data drives our decisioning, and data gets us to gets us success. And that's what we're all trained to believe. But when it comes to understanding the motivations and sentimentality of multicultural audiences, and for me, it was important to represent Black audiences much more prominently, the data was lacking, and it really moved very slowly. And so what we did at xStereotype was go out and actually do our own research and come up with our own data sets on how people perceive authenticity, how people perceive content, image, and language, and context. And we're able to quantify these measurements and use that in models to now help predict outcomes. What we found in our data is a 0.85 correlation, which is highly correlated, feelings of belonging, authenticity to purchase intent. It's kind of a no-duh. I was like, this is what I say all the time when I'm like, this doesn't make sense to me, but why are you running a car advertiser? But without the data, it's really hard to move people from one position to another. And what ended up happening is the data was so slow moving that we took our data and supercharged it, I think, with AI so that we can move much faster. So what took weeks and weeks of research before and analysis now takes 24 hours. In some cases, we get it back within hours. And so it's no longer a hindrance to be inclusive and and widen your net for audience participation, it's a business driver, and that's what xStereotype is doing for brands.
And Camilla, how is Sparks and Honey leveraging AI to understand fast and slow culture?
So our platform is categorizing culture against a taxonomy of trends, right? So that's the first sort of impetus, much like what you're describing in terms of the purpose behind building a platform that uses different types of machine learning to categorize culture, is to quantify, right? To be able to say, okay, first, can we think about culture, which is this network of beliefs, ideas, behaviors, conventions, and influence as unstructured data. So if we can think about culture as unstructured data, then can we build a system that can give it shape, that can structure it, and is able to recognize cultural trends within signals and then tag them against a taxonomy of trends, right? So you can speed up the analysis pretty much like, how you describe it, from weeks to seconds, right? In that context, and you asked a question about fast and slow culture, the idea of fast and slow culture comes from a number of different academic sources from like the 70s and 60s, et cetera. And it's this idea that you have different sources of influence for what we understand as culture, and some are coming from popular culture and fast culture, meaning, what you see in social media, articles, what you see on TV, so on and so forth. Some are going to come more from science, technology, academia, etc. We saw an opportunity to bring those two ends of the spectrum together to sort of normalize data across that full spectrum from fast to slow. And if you think about this, right, in the recent past, those two areas lived in complete different even departments within organizations, right? So you have like a marketing department that's very capable in like social listening or cultural listening, analyzing social media and consumer conversations, etc. So fast culture. And then you have like a corporate ventures group, or you have an R&D group that's actually looking at science and technology and academic research, so on and so forth, right? The speed of change demands that to truly understand the flow of influence in culture, that you are able to bring those two together. That's how you can like rewind back to, say, 2015, 2016, and you're looking at the future of, say, carbonated soft drinks, right? And you're starting to see a lot of consumer conversations on one hand around topics like fermentation and probiotics and prebiotics, and then you see on the other hand a lot of academic research and VC investment and different types of science around the microbiome and the gut-brain connection and all that, right? And when you see it all together for the first time, sorry, I think I applauded and burned the speakers. When you see it all together, suddenly the picture becomes really clear. There is a future in this category where gut health is going to be very important, right? You fast forward to 2024, 2023, and you have like Olipop and Poppy and a lot of different drinks doing that, right? So in order for you to be able to anticipate change, you have to make that connection between fast and slow culture.
So I should have been thinking about my gut health in 2012.
Yeah, for sure.
Noted.
Not too late. Never too late.
Never too late. It's too late for me to become Poppy or any of those things. So USC researchers found that bias in 40% of facts used by AI. Can you both talk about innovations that you're implementing to detect and mitigate bias in your work?
Should I start?
Yeah.
So I think that's a very interesting question, and the way we approach it is we first understand that AI bias is a wicked problem, right? So you think about the wicked problems is a category of problems that resist solutions, right? And it's a term that was invented in the 70s by urban planners who were thinking about problems like climate change and inequality. And think about it, like, that's in the 70s, go back like 50-something years to today, and we haven't solved inequality yet, right? So AI bias is a problem that resists solution, right? So your question is about innovation, right? I think fundamentally, number one innovation is to approach AI bias as a wicked problem. And that's very humbling. You're starting to see a lot of tech companies taking this approach, right? What does it mean, AI bias as a wicked problem? Number one, that it's easier to debias AI than to debias humans. So think about that for a second, right? I mean, humans are hardwired to be biased, right? That's how we survive out in the world. Our brains are prediction machines, and those prediction machines are using bias, right? So this is a really, really hard problem because fundamentally it is a human problem. The second thing is that bias is highly contextual, right? So if you go back to the beginning of the year, Gemini was in hot water. That's Google's generative AI model because of, founding fathers of color, for example, right? That shows how difficult it is to mitigate bias. I mean, that happened because there was a secondary layer of prompting that was intervening when you asked a question or gave the system a prompt, and then tried to debias the system by bringing diversity thinking into the equation, right? It so happens that if you're looking for an accurate picture of founding fathers, they're not going to be black. But if you are in another context thinking about what it could be, if you're in a more speculative frame of mind or context, then by all means, they're going to be like anything it could be, right? So that context is going to be really hard for machines to interpret, right? So when you say, okay, AI bias is a wicked problem, it's going to resist the solution, therefore we're going to approach it as such, you start to do things differently. So you start to say, for example, we're going to acknowledge the limitations of our efforts and communicate them clearly to the public and to our teams, to the people working with us, right? So that's one thing that you do that's going to be very different. Secondly, you create policies that are clear and transparent around AI ethics that you can communicate to everybody involved. You include also feedback loops. So people are able, users or even the teams that are working on it are able to provide feedback to the system constantly, because if it's not learning all the time, it's not AI, right? And then, and I'll say this last, then maybe you take the question of debias AI and flip it on its head and say, maybe the question is not debias AI, but actually to add bias into the system, right? So what does that mean? That means that the teams that are working on it must be representative of the culture that we're trying to work with and influence, right? That also means that perhaps we need to do an audit of training data and add, and you said something really interesting in the green room, and I'm not going to steal your thunder there, but add bias, meaning add data that's representative into the training models and make a conscious effort to understand that that's going to be a priority, right? So there's definitely a set of innovations that are also on the sort of AI, use of AI to address the AI bias problem. But I think the first one is a human, right? And it's all of the different things that we can do once we acknowledge it as a problem that resists a solution, right? And then from an algorithmic standpoint or from an AI standpoint, there are things that you can do in terms of thinking about the different taxonomies and how you bring representation into those taxonomies, how you make some of those problems more visible. You can also think about creating forward-looking models that are not leaning on historical data that's going to be biased by nature. But I'm going to let you talk a little bit more about those because you are the expert on those.
This is something that we're working on every day. To be honest, I can get into more technical things, but I want to get into the why. For me, when I look at the landscape across the AI, like everywhere, you see like very specific people running all these companies and technologies. And even when we were developing our research models, we worked with data scientists, neuroscientists, psychologists, and we were training them. And because what we're actually needing to do is lean in as people of color, of people of different perspectives, and actually take the reins of where we are from an AI perspective and get and start to build out these solutions. So from a day-to-day perspective, our thinking is, how do we start influencing, to Camilla's point, all the points of intersectionality in AI. It's the data that goes into it. It's the weighting of models. It's also like the training of all these large language models that we're kind of just giving, we're like, oh, well, let's just trust, this GPT, this thing. And it's really not right. It even says at the bottom, like, it's not right. Like, they make mistakes. So when we think about like culture and how we're like reflected in AI, that starts at the very sort of beginning point, which is the data. And that's why we're focused on that so intently, because the tools will express only what we put into it. And so much of it gets ignored. And I think, what we're so focused on is the human insights that what we feel is missing from the AI context. There's a lot of observed behavioral patterns that are getting sort of churned back out, like, oh, I live on a street with a white picket fence. That has nothing to do with how and why I make decisions. And those are the things that we need to start feeding into the intelligence into the AI intelligences. What is our human experience? What makes us feel? And start to like be able to train it and to understand that. I think your point earlier is like the people that are behind this come into this with their own bias, and they're adding their own weights to things. They're adding their own perspective. And without scaled data to sort of balance that, we end up in worlds where we get results of craziness, and it's because of one engineer or one data scientist's perspective on how things should be, rather than how we all perceive different outcomes and how that comes together in recommendations. So I don't know if I can answer the question directly in like an operation perspective, but I really think it's about personally getting involved and personally pushing back when we see things that don't feel right, to actually start pushing the data upstream from a user perspective, as well as from a business perspective, driving that conversation through data advocacy, like really creating new models and bringing that together with the technology.
No, that's actually perfect, because it leads into my next question of how can AI be a superpower at addressing hyper-personalization in culture in ways we haven't seen it done before?
With the things that we're able to provide from an xStereotype perspective, the insights that we've gathered over the last, we started our business like out of the I would say the ashes of the George Floyd world, where things kind of flipped upside down and people started to understand like, hey, there's a whole group of folks that we haven't talked to before or thought about. And in all that time, we've aggregated over 10 million data points of what people think and feel about content. And what that kind of insight is what's really going to deliver against this sort of nirvana state that we all want, which is give me an ad with a mom and a dad that are eating breakfast. And it's going to be able to provide, like, having that data as a reference point for understanding how people perceive breakfast and, or a meal, and kids and parents will get you better outcomes. So I would say it's the data in, it registers with what you get out, but the tools of how to get it done are moving so fast. The last time we had sort of technical transition, even from like basic ones, from moving to digital television, it like took a year. Like, we're moving in 3-month increments where tools are becoming so good, but we need to make sure the data keeps up and the perspectives keep up with the tools advancements. And that's where I'm really focused. And I think that's where we all should be focused, is really pushing on what is feeding these outcomes, what is actually driving the insights. And if it's not what you think it is, I think start it, do something.
Yeah, when it comes to hyper-personalization, I think the question of AI bias is incredibly important for one reason, right? I mean, AI brings to the table a tool or a set of tools that for the first time in the history of humanity, and this is not hyperbole, that we're dealing with a tool that can make choices, right? So we're not, like, you think about like the most sophisticated computer, not very different from a hammer, in the sense that if you hit enter and you give it a command, it's going to execute that command for you. You do the hammer and the nail, and the thing goes down. So you're executing, the tool is executing something on your behalf. It's doing a task on your behalf. It's not making a choice in your behalf. The hammer is not suddenly going to say, oh no, don't hit here, hit over here. Or the computer is not going to suddenly rewrite your code unless you want it to, right? So that's an era of tools that are subservient to us as humans in that decision making. AI, and you're starting to see some glimpses of what it can do today. It is a very different type of tool because it's a tool that's trained to make decisions, right? So when you look at sort of the trajectory of personalization, we are today already in a pretty crazy space. I mean, some people hate it, some people find it magical. You try going to your Instagram and search once for like probiotic soda, and then let it come to you in all types. Craft soda, it'll know exactly the type of brand that you resonate with you and what it would like. It will follow you everywhere, right? So it's a very primitive way of what we're about to see, right? Where the battlefield becomes sort of very different, right? You're going from a battlefield of attention, right, where we're all competing for the attention of the people that are out there, to a space where we're competing for intimacy. Because when tools make choices on your behalf, when you're delegating decisions, not tasks, when you're saying, oh, book me a trip for my anniversary, and if I get divorced afterwards, it's your fault. The trust and the intimacy that you have with that type of personalization is very different, right? And it becomes sort of a gatekeeper for a number of different things. So I think that to your point around data advocacy, right? A lot of these decisions are going to be made by models that are trained with data that's really great at predicting the past, right? And we need to advocate for data that's representative of the present and the future, right? So I really love that line. I told you were going to steal it.
Yeah, but a build onto this. Sorry to go off, but like when you talk about hyper-personalization, and you were talking about sort of the impetus of it. One of the things I think is also very important to talk about from a strategic perspective on using AI is your prompting. And this is where people actually have, that's what I was talking about, personal accountability. Even in the statement that I made about generating an ad for mom and dad at breakfast, I'm bringing my own bias to what is actually what is a mealtime. And so if we start and this is where the data actually does start to sort of overcome the human capacity in a way, because you can actually, through a data set like ours, you can actually correct for that. And that is where AI becomes super powerful, is when it's actually informed with scale data on different perspectives that haven't been available to it before, instead of taking our own bias as direction to generate more of the bias. So it's kind of you end up, and this is why I totally geek out on this, because from my perspective and my point of view of how do I change how people perceive people that look like me? How do I change the perspective of the world when it comes to just topically identifying folks and doing things? It's really when they start to see things normalized. But I would imagine prompting in my mind is old school creative briefs. You have this guy usually a guy that writes it in, and then it pops out what he wrote in, and that's the same place that we are in with AI. And that's why it's so important to really focus on the nexus of the data and what's driving the what is actually coming out of that, but also to really sort of interrogate what you're entering into the system and the AI, and what you're sort of manifesting in a way, and what you're kind of actually bringing to bear through your own unconscious bias.
To that point, and to your point about trust and what the outputs are, thinking about it from a brand perspective, how can brands maintain consumer trust while navigating the complexities of AI and all that comes with it?
In all of our research, high bias just breaks trust. People that feel like there is bias or unauthentic representation is the fastest way to break that trust. And so what we haven't had for a long time, and I think that AI is helping us, are those signals to identify authenticity, identify what would be perceived as bias to bridge to trust. And so when people feel seen by another person, they start to trust. They open up and they start to actually build relationships. And I think it's the same for brands. If a brand is representing inauthentic representations of groups and they don't feel seen or they feel misrepresented, that's the fastest way to distrust. And I think that starts to erode. I actually believe a lot of models that we use today on purchase intent and other things sort of use past behavior sort of as a crutch. But if someone comes in and has a better way of authentically connecting with me or my consumers, they're going to win that buy, no matter how much I actually know that I need a white button down every 6 months. There's a lot of times where inertia, we're just kind of calculating inertia in our current models rather than actually understanding motivations and connectivity to actually win the purchase. Camilla, you talked about just following folks around. So a lot of our KPIs look great. Our ROAS looks great because I got that click. Well, we were just there all the time. We didn't convince someone to buy it. We were just opportunistically there. So brands are going to have to start to, and I think for a big part, are leaning into understanding how to authentically connect with audiences, how to authentically represent different communities.
100% in agreement with you, Larry. It's a great question. Thank you. I think from a tactical perspective also, we have to recognize that for a brand, when you think about trust, right? Trust is context dependent, right? So I trust my mechanic to deal with my car, but maybe not so much to deal with a broken tooth or something like that. So the same thing applies for brands, right? So if you want to earn the trust of people out there when it comes to your use of AI, you have to understand what are you competent at and why are you going to be credible when it comes to putting a point of view out in the market or putting an AI out in the market. And then you got to fill in the blanks on all the gaps with different partnerships and doing different types of homework, right? Mm-hmm. It's very different for a brand like Instagram, for example, to earn the trust of people when it comes to AI than for a CPG brand, right? So those are very, very, very different contexts. The other thing is you got to ask yourself the question, if you're entering the space, whether you have a clear policy. That it's an AI ethics policy that's publicly accessible, that your teams know about really well, and that people can scrutinize. And then you have to, just building on Larry's point in terms of you got to think deeply about the data, right? Because AI is being fed, all this data, but when it comes to specific brands, and you're talking about first-party data or user data. Now we're getting into a space where the data is becoming more and more intimate, right? It is going from behavior, right? So, maybe your click stream on a website and what you do before and after, augmented by third-party data. So now I know who you are and where you live and a lot of other contexts. But now we're increasingly going into a world where we're looking at a phone that has a camera that's pointed at you, that's looking at your facial expression and could conceivably recognize your emotive state at different points in time. We're dealing with now technology where you have everybody, raise your hand here if you have not doubted at some point that Alexa or Siri or whomever is listening to your conversations. Right. If you think it's like you talk about Aruba and suddenly you see a bus with an Aruba billboard showing up, right? And nobody knows definitely, but if you look at the patents, what those companies are putting out there in terms of patents, the technology and what the capability and what it can do, you'll be very surprised. It so happens that a lot of these organizations that have access to your voice can even detect disease, like your emotive state, your risk of Parkinson's, years before your doctors can even tell that, right? So that data is very, very intimate, right? So again, if you want to earn trust, you got to give people control over their data, and you got to do it in a way that's clear and easy to understand, right? And control is it's a very generic type of, what that really means is you own your data, you have recourse if it's used improperly, and if you want to earn like brownie points, then you go into interoperability, you go into being able to take your data from this platform to this other, so on and so forth.
So we touched on trust, we touched on bias in this room full of marketers. What's most important to understand today about AI?
I think like the intention of how you prompt it really, like I think most of us in the room will end up dealing with it from a prompt perspective and what we're actually driving into it to get out of it. And so for folks individually, just understand like, okay, even the way I'm asking this question could create a perceptual or outcome that I'm not wanting, but I'm unconsciously driving. So it's almost like spend some time in understanding how to sort of uncouple a little of that and get to what is your connectivity to your audience and understanding authenticity of that audience, not your interpretation of it. Like I think the interpretation of it through our own lens of life experience creates this point of sort of failure at the prompt. And I think, until we get like scaled solutions like xStereotype and others out there, it's gonna be up to us individually to expand our perspective by trusting either other sources or listening specifically to what my consumer actually thinks is authentic, not my interpretation of it. And then when I'm going in and prompting the heck out of this thing for an image or story or content for social media or email, making sure I'm not driving it to a place that is sort of a biased outcome just because of the fact that I didn't listen to the information, I actually interpreted it through my lens.
I would say that if it's not learning, it's not AI, right? So if the thing that you're using, can be super sophisticated, but if you're not building in the mechanism to learn and adapt to the changing world that we live in, then it's not AI, right? And you're leaving a lot of money on the table and possibly can be making really wrong decisions. Like, I give you an example. Like, worked with a large Hollywood studio a few years ago, which came to us and say, hey, we have this amazing predictive model to select green light films, but we passed on films like Parasite. We passed on films like Get Out, right? And, you think about if you know those films, like you can then think, okay, maybe your predictive models were not so good at predicting because they were based on, historical data, right? Maybe they are good at predicting the past, right? So in that context, how are you bringing forward-looking data, right? How are you creating your own forward-looking data that allows you to paint a picture of this changing world that we live in?
That's great. And so thinking big, what's your vision for the future of AI as it pertains to marketing?
I want an AI that is evolved from where we are today from a human perspective, that actually understands different perspectives, that understands that the human experience is a little bit more complicated than just some facts that are referenced in a sort of a right or left-leaning newspaper or article that was written about in 1980 or 2000s, that it's actually, to Camilla's point, understanding and evolving and learning and presenting what we are today. I feel like the technology of the past has been so gatekept by specific points of view and driven by very much an outcome of these groups holding on to their worlds. I think AI unlocks that and gets us all in a place of actually driving the outcomes that we want, enabling us to do what we couldn't do before: start businesses, make movies, start a blog, do all these things, and be way more productive, and having like really technology that reflects us as people rather than a small group of people that control it.
I hope for a future that's ethical, right? And that requires us, all of us in this room and in the industry, to acknowledge that, number one, there's not like a singular future, right? That is not written, that is plural, right? And that we can envision what that multiplicity, plurality of futures look like, right? And some are going to be preferable than others. Some are going to be dark. Some are going to be productive and constructive and creative and interesting. I think we need to ask ourselves the question, how do we identify the future that we want to build? And then, what are the steps that we need to take today to get there?
That's great. Well, thank you both. This was an amazing conversation. I took away a lot, so I hope that you did too. I'm going to walk around saying, if it's not learning, it's not AI moving forward. But thank you both for your insights and everything that we've shared today.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Great. We have to sit here.